Well, hey, Swapnil, thanks for joining today. And I think this is going to be the first of hopefully many chats that we have where we talk about some of the latest things that are happening in cloud technology. Like today, I was thinking we could talk about some of the things that are coming out of a new direction that people are talking about, which is the NoOps direction. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of the company that I run, Cumulus Technologies, where we help people find the right path into cloud, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming at this concept from. And so, how about yourself?
Yeah. So when I look at NoOps, I have two queries. One is that the tech IT industry, tech industry, it keeps looking for new buzzwords every now and then.
Gotta have a new one this week, right?
Yeah. In the early days when they were trying to sell new refrigerators, they will come up with new, buzzwords. It has this cooling and that cooling that's happening.
Right.
So when I look at NoOps, first of all, let's go a step backward and look at DevOps. Why was the word coined? What was the problem that was kind of intended to solve, break the silos, and everybody's doing everything. So let's touch upon that and then we see the evolution.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So if we start with DevOps, to me, DevOps is interesting because I would say it really came about, 10-ish years ago or so, maybe a little bit more now. I keep forgetting that time passes, right? But to me, DevOps was really driven by a desire to get to simpler, more reusable development processes. And one of the things that the developer community really had frustration with was the fact that the infrastructure that they were developing on top of was not particularly flexible, right? You had to go talk to an IT department, or even if you were using a third party, so maybe you had a cloud-like vendor, even though it wasn't really considered cloud at the time, you basically had to put in a trouble ticket. It would take time to get anything provisioned. If you found that you needed a change because your application required something, it would always take time. So there were these huge delays in how the infrastructure supported the development process. And that was the operations part of DevOps. The developer side was being driven, the desire for speed was being driven by new models for how developers were working with code. Source code repositories have been around for quite a long time, but using the source code repository as a way of effectively communicating with your peers and accelerating the development process was a large part of what I think drove DevOps. Things like the creation of the Git source code repository and branch-based models for source management was really driving that. So you had these sort of two different areas, and they were starting to come together. And in the DevOps space specifically, the way that came together was that companies like Amazon, and there were others, Amazon's not the only one, they were just the most prevalent and actually ended up with the quickest sort of scaled out reach for this class of technology. Amazon said, hey, you can control our infrastructure via the kinds of application interfaces that you would use in communicating within your application development itself. So suddenly the developer said, well, if you give me that kind of control, I can develop directly against your infrastructure. So I can ask for a computer, I can ask for network, I can ask for storage service just by an API call. And I can take that code, that infrastructure model, and I can treat it like code, which means that I can store it in a source code repository. Right? So the developer suddenly said, I don't necessarily need a separate operations staff to handle things that I used to have them do. Like I don't have to ask somebody else for a computer. I can get it automatically. Even better, I can potentially return it when I'm done if I remember to do that, which is always the big trick, right? But that's, right. To me, that's the nexus of DevOps as a technology, right? That's kind of where it started.
Right. So what has changed that suddenly now we need NoOps? And ops, I understand, NoOps understand operations, but where do the dev portion go there? So can you talk about...
So I think, again, the idea behind the dev side of things, dev doesn't really change, at least doesn't change dramatically. We can start talking about containers and some of these other new technologies, but that's not really what's driving development. Rather, the dev side, I think, still stays fairly similar in that we're still thinking about managing code in source code repositories, using things like the continuous integration and automation technologies that sit behind the developer and support accelerating the developer's workflow. Agile development process and extreme development peering and pairs programming, all those things still stay the same. The question is, how much of the infrastructure does the operator have to work with? And I think NoOps is just another way of thinking about using a platform instead of infrastructure to support your application development process. And now what I mean there is the platform services. So things that are talked about as PaaS, platform as a service, tools like Heroku, OpenShift, Cloud Foundry. These tools take the development process and the infrastructure is effectively automated out of the way. Right, so I don't have to think about computers and networks and storage. I think about maybe compute units. Can I scale things up and down? And I think about storage environments, usually databases, and I want to talk to a database. But the platform is abstracting that, right? So my operations becomes application-focused operations rather than infrastructure-focused operations. And I think this is where the NoOps comes from. I remove the infrastructure operations from my application development cycle.
Right. That's and at the same time as you know, more and more things are getting automated, so you really don't need ops anymore because they're.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea, or that the abstractions are changing what operations mean. So I think that there's another movement which is reasonably recent, also another buzz term, I guess, in the market, and that is the systems reliability engineer or the cloud reliability engineer, depending on who you're talking to these days. And that's an interesting role that is not a DevOps role, and yet there is this expectation of automation. There's this expectation of managing your resources via code, and it sort of stems out of the operations community, right? Because even in the DevOps space, the developers didn't give up and say, okay, everybody's now a full-time developer and a full-time operator. In small companies, 5-person teams, sure, that might have been the case. But when you start looking at 30 and 50 and 100-person organizations building applications, there's the whole pizza team concept of 10 or 15 people being kind of the maximum, or the 2-pizza team concept, I guess, being the maximum. And then again, who only eats one slice of pizza? I mean, help me with this one. But, so we have that whole concept of what is a pizza team, and how do you break down your operations and your development, especially when you get larger, into these different organizations, which means that you already had a team that was focusing more on operations, even if they were in the DevOps world mindset of, I'm going to deal with that in terms of automation and in terms of APIs. That's there. So now if we go to NoOps, we say, well, we don't need those guys, right? So let's just fire them all. What a great idea, right? No, I don't think that's what's happening. Right. Instead, what I think is actually happening is that the folks that handled more of the operations burden. I mean, even in a 3-person team, you're going to end up with one guy or gal. I'm not trying to be, we have one person whose focus is really more on the resources that are supporting the application. If I'm using object storage to manage that, well, somebody still has to manage the object storage and manage the scale and manage the resiliency and delivery and all the sort of back-end processes that the object store system doesn't handle for you. So I'm not thinking about it as storage, as in disk storage, but it's just a target for my application. If I'm thinking about compute resources that scale up and down over time, I'm still thinking about how do they scale, what happens if they scale, what happens if they scale down, what happens if I lose connections. Somebody's thinking about those processes even in a small team and potentially writing code around it. Well, if I don't have to think about compute as a computer and an operating system and then my application on top, I can get rid of that part of the operation cycle. And I think that's what NoOps is really starting to focus in on. I can remove a lot of the infrastructure operations, and I'm going to hand that to somebody else. I mean, this is really the key. I'm going to give this to a cloud provider. Now, in a very large organization, that might still be my IT company. But they've given me APIs, they've given me abstractions that make it easier and easier and easier for me to think not so much about the computer and the network and the storage, but how does my application interact with those resources at an abstracted level?
Right. So I'll just pick your last word, that I'll just move it to some other external cloud provider. But if you look at vendors who offers operating system, let's say Red Hat, for example, right. That's why when you talk about serverless, Red Hat and SUSE, they cringe because they say there is a server in serverless too. Someone
I always say that too. Serverless is my least favorite marketing term.
Exactly.
Actually, I think right up there with NoOps right now.
Yeah, function as service makes sense. So in that case, someone has to manage. Yes, when you are moving a lot of things to a cloud provider where he or she is managing that, but if you are running your own data center or if you're a Red Hat client, then you cannot hand it over. You have to hand it over to some team. right? You cannot just hand it over to a cloud. Just the way in serverless, you cannot, okay, the developer is using function as a service, but someone else is managing the backend. So in case of NoOps also, there will still be DevOps, or still be traditional, sysadmins and all those people. So does DevOps mean, what does DevOps mean in this use case?
So I think DevOps shifts in that, and that's why I brought up SRE, because in the NoOps world, I believe what people are really thinking about, and this is where I think we can see this differentiation. I think NoOps started to come up when people were looking at a tool like Kubernetes. Right. So in the Kubernetes world, the abstraction that a developer has to deal with is effectively the compute target, the unit of compute, which is their actual application process, not all of the underlying resources, the operating system, the kernel that has to be there, the storage and network connections that have to be there to make this all work. I've abstracted that so far away that I start thinking about policy towards those sorts of resources. I know I still have some way of storing things. That doesn't go away. That's a part of my application model. I know I have ways of connecting resources together, but I think of them more along the lines of policy. And even some of the terms that are used within the Kubernetes space as an example of this, persistent volume claims. That's a policy against a piece of storage. I want something persistent, and I want to claim it for my own. How it gets managed, what technology it's used, I don't care about any of that. Maybe I can define policy against, I would like a different class of storage, fast versus slow. But I'm not saying, hey, I need solid state disk and I need NVMe disk or I need NAS attached. I don't care about any of that, right? And it's been abstracted away. So infrastructure is still there, but it keeps getting abstracted in more and more layers. And if I think about, to me, the extreme case of that, the what I think of now as classic platform as a service versus these sort of customizable platform as a service offerings like Kubernetes. The classic ones were Cloud Foundry, Heroku, even OpenShift, where my focus as a developer was on my code and telling the system that was going to then consume that code, hey, here are the requirements that my code has, basically the libraries that my code needs to run. Here are the pieces of my code that need to run together. Here's how they're supposed to talk to each other. I describe it at that level, and then magic happens, right? Now, the operation still has to happen. Somebody still has to run the OpenShift or Heroku or Cloud Foundry service. And I can go to a service provider to do that, or in some cases I can do that in-house as well, which means that I still have an IT staff. But even the IT staff, right? Even in the NoOps world, the IT staff, in order to be able to address the speed and performance and expectations of the development staff, I have to automate the infrastructure. I have to automate the deployment and upgrade and failure management of my infrastructure, which means that the ops teams are doing as much automation and DevOps-like work, but against an operational infrastructure rather than an application infrastructure. And the NoOps community, I'm pretty sure, is a bunch of developers. That's their mindset. I'm going to develop my application. I don't have to think about that infrastructure operations anymore. That's really where NoOps lives.
And in your professional capacity, you also consult. That's when the whole DevOps movement was there, there's a lot of confusion what it was, and it was you should adopt DevOps practices. First of all, people did not even know what DevOps is. Is it engineering? Is it people? Is it practices? It is a new buzzword or term. So in case of NoOps, what is your advice to companies? How they should, because is it about technology, or is it about people, or is it about culture, and how should they look at it, and how they should prepare themselves?
Yeah. So look, the shift that NoOps is driving isn't so much a big shift that most companies have to deal with. I think, when I consult, usually I start at the very beginning. I say, okay, let's look at cloud strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? If NoOps is an interesting buzzword, we can figure out where that fits. But once we understand what your goals are in cloud, we can actually then figure out what technologies, what architectures fit. Because to me, NoOps is an architectural model. It's an approach to application development that shifts the burden of infrastructure responsibility and infrastructure management responsibility into a different domain. And so you're basically saying, rather than in a DevOps lifecycle where the developers and operators effectively live together or try to live as close together as possible, in the NoOps case, we want to do that split again. So if the strategy is that NoOps allows the developers to focus exclusively on their applications, and that means that somebody else has to take on infrastructure and some form of platform functionality. Again, be that I want continuous delivery, and so I need to stick together a GitLab or Jenkins plus Spinnaker plus Artifactory engine to support deployment into a Kubernetes environment at the end. That might be a flow. That might be the set of resources that now have to be implemented in the company in order to turn on the ability to use this NoOps concept within the development staff. In other words, developers no longer have to think about any of the infrastructure. Actually, I just put together a video on my YouTube channel that talks about the lack of developers using kube control. So in the Kubernetes world, there's the kubectl or kube control command line client that manages the Kubernetes tooling and infrastructure. It says, how do I want my application to run in that space? In one view of the NoOps space, in reality, you never should have the developers talking to Kubernetes, right? The developers would use Kubernetes only through committing code into the automated continuous delivery pipeline, right? So it's sort of saying, yes, if that's the right architecture based on the strategy that we've defined, you can actually get to saying, this is how we need to implement these services, and here's the back-end work that somebody has to operate. Now, maybe I can go to a service provider and get somebody to deliver me a continuous delivery pipeline. There are a number of companies out there that do this sort of thing. But if I do that, then I say, well, my operations has been moved to, part of my operations has been moved to this third-party SaaS vendor, software as a service vendor, and part of it is maybe now also being deployed and delivered into a public cloud or virtual private cloud type environment, so that I can then release that to my end customer, which might be an internal company customer, or it might be an external facing customer as well, right? And that's kind of the, if you think about it, strategy drives architecture, architecture drives the actual tool selection, and the tool selection then drives how do we actually work with this. So being able to pass that information on requires education or basically enabling that sort of custody of those application environments for the end user.
And now let's talk about one of the core stakeholders, developers themselves.
Yeah.
How should they prepare themselves for this new change in paradigm?
Well, I think for the developer, it's easier, right? I always said developers hate DevOps, and that was kind of like one of those anti-pattern comments. People were like, "Oh, yeah, right. You're just looking for more hits on your Twitter feed or what have you." But in reality, I think that developers ended up in the DevOps cycle because it was the only way for them to actually accomplish their tasks, right? Somebody said, hey, I need you to deliver me this feature as quickly as possible. And initially that was, well, if you want me to deliver this feature, I have to turn something on. I have to go and deploy a VM. I have to, get the storage attached. I have to figure out how the network is supposed to deliver my access to my service. And if I wait for IT to do that, it's going to take 3 months before I can even start to deliver that feature. Now I suddenly have the ability to do it, but that means I have to do it myself. I have to now deal with security and patching my operating systems and making sure that my firewall rules are right and all the other things that come along with that. So I've just added this burden onto my shoulders, along with, don't forget to get that feature done. Right, the NoOps movement and sort of this further abstraction. Basically, I think of it more as a modification or a modern version of the platform as a service movement. Really means that the developers go back to focusing on what is really important and what a company probably hired them to do. Add feature XYZ to the platform. Right, enable these resources, enable these services, and that way we can actually build better product. Let's get the infrastructure moved out of the development community and back to where it belongs, into a group of developers, and I still think of them as developers, but developers that are focused on how to manage and operate that infrastructure, scale it, make it reliable, do all those sorts of things, versus the folks that are just adding new features into the platform, right? And that's where I think the developers are potentially happiest too. Go build me a new feature. Make that feature better, right? Add functionality to that feature. Make the UI look glitzier, etc. Right. That's where the developer fits.
And that's what they were meant to do from the very early on. But I mean, that's why the whole evolution, from VMs, so that they can just focus on their app, not all the fluff that they have to bother themselves with, I think we touched about we can actually sit down and talk for hours and hours. That's what we do when we always meet. But, I think we touched upon some core points. And of course, we can talk about operators and everything else in the future episodes, which will keep us, busy for the next episodes as well.
Exactly.
First of all, thanks for, joining me today for this first episode of our show that we may be doing more in future. Yep. Maybe actually we can also do when we are on site together at the events. We can try to do it together on site. So as you know, at TFR we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and all the emerging technologies and open source. Tell us about your channel. What do you do there?
Yeah, so we have Cumulus on Cloud. We've kind of rebranded it from 5 minutes of cloud because we really are focusing more on how we consult, right? And it's really focused on our consulting strategy, right? So we start with strategy, architecture, the actual tools, implementation concepts, and then education, or really how to hand custody over to the customer of that model. And we do that at 5 minutes of cloud channel, right?
So what kind of content people can expect from your channel?
So most of what we're doing is this sort of conversation about new technology components, things to think about in strategy and architecture, and we're adding more little tutorials like how do new technologies fit. So we have some sort of longer form models where we've looked at some container security recently as an example, and that's hands-on. I get on the keyboard and start typing away, but certainly this class of just sort of explaining something sort of vlog-like style as well is a large part of what we do there. And on TFIR, what are people going to find on your channel?
I have a wide range of topics that we cover. I am also starting some basics because my audience goes mostly developers audience, but I'm evolving into, as the TFR is evolving into more, as I said, emerging technologies. So mostly what I do is I do interviews, or you can call it shows. You can call it Graham Norton show or David Letterman show, because we talk about not just technology but also their personal life, and a lot of fun stuff happens at the end of the interviews. So it's more like a mix of technology versus entertaining people. So my channel, as I said, covers the whole gamut of emerging technologies, all the way from machine learning to IoT to it's when you talk about emerging technologies, it covers everything, right?
Absolutely.
Right. They just found water on Mars, so maybe we can cover that also. Then how did they find it? Because they are using some kind of cloud and containers. Right? Yeah. Because I actually talked to CERN, at Open Tech Summit. That was a 30-minute interview with Tim Bell. I have to publish that, and so we do a lot of fun stuff there.
Yeah.
Keep and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and Robert's channel, and we'll see you probably next week or maybe next to next week in the next show, where we'll talk about operations part side of NoOps, right?
Right.
No operation in NoOps.
The ops of NoOps, right?
NoOps of the NoOps. Thanks for watching.
Stay tuned to the next channel.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.